Our first speaker is Adam Pisoni. If you don't know a little bit about his story, he's the co-founder of Yammer, which sold to Microsoft for an obscene amount of money, I think $1.2 billion. He's working now in an area that is of particular passion for me, which is education, building an education company, Able Schools, which takes software and transforms how schools allocate resources to better serve their students. And in the process of growing Yammer, Adam realized that he was no longer building a software company, but he was building an organization. And so with that in mind, he reached out and sort of went on a listening tour and met a lot of different people, including Aaron Dignan, who I see in the audience, and Micah Rouse, who I know is here, and Alexis Gonzalez-Black and others, and built Responsive.org, which is the manifesto and the community and the dozens and dozens of meetups that have been occurring all over the world. So without any further introduction, it's really my pleasure and honor to introduce my friend, Adam Pisoni.
Thanks. Hello, great, you can hear me. That's loud, that's loud. Thank you, Robin. Thank you for putting this on. It's pretty amazing to see so many people here. This is actually a really special conference for me because less than 4 years ago, the Responsive.org didn't exist. And I just checked on Meetup, and in the last month or within a month, there were literally meetups in Zurich, in Paris, in Poland, in Portland. A lot of cities start with P, obviously. There must be a correlation. And so, how did that happen? How does something like this come about? So there's a couple things I want to talk about, but I actually want to start pretty briefly with a history of the Responsive.org, how this came about, and therefore sort of why you're here. So what is Responsive.org? Robin touched on it, but I'm going to frame it slightly differently. The Responsive.org is a description of what's possible, of what we think the future holds for us, where we think companies are going. It's a description of the conditions that have made it possible or the changes. But what's the point of having a description like that? Many of you know, I've seen shifts like these, and these aren't the only ones. You may be asking, well, what does the Responsive.org have to do with reinventing organizations and all of those? But again, to understand sort of why we even set about to create something like this, you've got to have the quick history. Back in 2008, as Robin mentioned, I helped co-found this company called Yammer. And when we started, I knew nothing about the history of work, the future of work, anything to do with work, really. I had only worked at startups or my own companies, and I had very little sympathy or empathy for large companies or their challenges. Our whole thing was Twitter and Facebook had blown up. We were going to bring social into the enterprise. That was it. But pretty quickly, as we began building the product, working with customers, we found that it was large companies and organizations that were pretty attracted to it, but that they were having an incredibly difficult time changing the way they worked in a way that would be beneficial to them. We were promoting transparency and empowerment, and look what you could do if everybody could communicate. And yet, they just weren't moving that quickly. We were in there giving them tips and trying to help them, but they just weren't changing that quickly. So let's just fast forward. In 2012, actually, Microsoft approached us and said, not only do we want to buy you as a product, but we want you to come and try to change Microsoft. Not even joking. They literally said, we're looking at what you're talking about, how you're working. We want you to come change Microsoft. So we came in with that charge. Fast forward a little bit, 2013. Been at Microsoft for less than a year. And I'm reflecting at this point with some coworkers on how slow things are moving. How, well, we have grown tremendously. We've sold to Microsoft. It still feels like companies just aren't moving that quickly, and that we don't really have the leverage to help them change. We're fighting every day to try to get them to just admit that the world has changed. Now, we can do a lot with our product, but it felt like we were at the end of what we could do with our product alone. Now, around that same time, I ended up reading this book called The Insurgency. Is Chris Fussell here yet? No? I'm very excited that he's going to be here because this wasn't planned, by the way, that he's here, but he was one of the main characters in this book. This book is about General Stanley McChrystal and his time during the mid-2000s when he was essentially running the Iran and Afghanistan war during the worst years. I'm not a big military man. I'm not trying to make any militaristic comments on this. But what was interesting to me, and so this happens around the mid-2000s, long before Future of Work movement and Yammer, And McChrystal is convinced, along with many others, that the problem is the world has changed, and the enemy they face is no longer a big bureaucracy that is expected to move slowly, but in fact, it's more like a network. It's unexpected, uncertain, complex, and he realizes that the only way to succeed in that environment is to become more like a network themselves. To fight more like a network was his words. And it's funny because I totally cribbed that with work more like a network. Totally stolen from this book, by the way. And I'll admit that. And part of what they were realizing was that when you're in a situation where there are believers on the other side, you can employ an insurgency strategy to help organizations change from within if you can't sort of change them from the outside. So I ran back to Yammer after reading this, and I said, you know, I have noticed that at each of our customers, there are these pockets of resistance. There are these groups of people who want to see change happen really badly. And yet they feel alone, and they're not emboldened to act because they feel like they're isolated and that there's no one there helping them. And reasoned that if we just figured out a way to connect them somehow, then maybe it would give them the leverage to embolden them to change within their organizations. That was the original idea. So a small group of us, Nate Fink and Chris Gale and Mike Graffam and some other people just got together and decided this shouldn't be that hard because in order to gather these people, we don't have to write an argument for why you should be responsive org. We don't have to write a thesis about how the world has changed. We don't have to write an exhaustive list of what you need to do. We just have to create a simple, concise set of controversial statements that people can read and say, yeah, that resonates with me. That really resonates with me. And if we could hand that to someone at IBM and they said, that resonates with me, and we handed it to someone at Ford, and they said, that resonates with me, and we could hand it to someone in the government, we could say, you know what, you're all part of the same team. You're all actually in the same movement just because you believe in similar things. So we wrote up this manifesto, and of course, around the same time we learned, of course, we weren't the only ones working on this. We hooked up with what was then Undercurrent, and there's a bunch of ex-Undercurrenters here, like Aaron Dignan and Micah Rouse, who are literally working on the same thing. I'm sure at the same time, reinventing organizations and all of these things were coming about at the same time. So here we are, years later, and there are meetups all around the world, and there's hundreds of people here. I had nothing to do with this conference, actually. It's sort of taken a life of its own, meetups around the world, and I've been really reflective years later on, well, how did that happen? How does change happen? Why haven't companies changed faster, or organizations, and what can we do about it? And the reason why I'm so reflective right now is a year plus ago, I actually took a little bit of a step back from responsive org. I decided that I wanted to shift my focus from helping companies be responsive to helping schools be more responsive. And I really love this Peter Senge quote because at the time, one of my big reasons was after years and years of fighting with adults inside of large organizations, I figured, I'm going to start when they're kids, before they have their minds set, and then I just won't have to deal with any of the adults who just... Well, I made a grave miscalculation, because it turns out in order to get to schools and their kids, you still have to go through adults. So I'm back where I started, trying to change schools, which are just organizations after all. But I knew nothing of education. I literally knew nothing about the system. I am actually a high school dropout. I literally didn't even finish high school. So what gave me any hope of changing one of the most entrenched and unchanging systems there is? I was blown away when I started researching education that when you listen to the big educational reformers, they tell a story which is almost identical to the ones we tell in the responsive movement. If you've ever seen one of my talks or Aaron or Mike's talks, it always starts with companies, it started with the Industrial Revolution, and we still do companies the same way. And if you squint at companies, they do look very similar. But you do not have to squint at schools. They literally are the same as they were 100 years ago. Same subject, same time, same people. It's just the same. And so why did I think I could come in and have any impact whatsoever? So what I want to just spend the rest of the time talking about is how does change happen? How do individuals create change? How do groups create change? So we're going to start with a simple axiom, which is change. That's the first thing to remember, the first thing I learned. Whether it's schools or government or your company or your team, change is change. And the reason why change is because To change systems requires changing minds. Change is about people, and people are people. So change is change, no matter what you're trying to change. And what I learned about changing people is that it's incredibly difficult. People don't want to change. And part of the critical factors in your ability to create change are these two things, power and leverage. As I reflected actually about talking about this, I realized that these are kind of dirty words sometimes, because we think about abuses of power or leverage in negotiation. It feels dishonest in some ways. But the reality is how change happens. Without any power and leverage, it's hard to do more than complain, which helps a little bit, but not a lot. But you're part of many systems in your life. You're part of many things you're trying to change, whether it's your family, your community, whatever. And at any given moment, you have a different power and leverage, a different position of power and leverage. I want to give you a little example of what this means, though. So I am the CEO of Able. I can control who I hire and fire. I have that power. But I don't have the reputation or the leverage to get Michelle Obama to work for me after she gets out of office. No matter how much I want to, that's not what I can do. As the CTO of Yammer, I did not have any power to change our customers, but I could use the product and I could use responsive org as leverage to help them change. I was trying to work with what we have. I neither have the power nor the leverage to convince my girlfriend to like the shows I like. So you get the idea, power and leverage. And so what I want to do is talk about strategies, because we want to be actionable about this. Strategies. At any given moment, in any system that you're trying to change, you are in one of these quadrants. You are somewhere in this matrix. And while change is change, what you need to do, it depends on your position, depends on where you are. Your strategy will be different depending on where you are. So let's start with low power, low leverage. Again, you can complain. That's something you can do, but it's not very effective, trust me. The first thing is, if you're in a position of low power and low leverage, that is not an excuse to not have a point of view. Complaining is fine if you have a point of view. You never know when you will suddenly be in a position where you'll have increased power or leverage, or when someone who has that power or leverage comes and asks you what you think. It's important to have your own point of view. But the other thing you can try to do is increase your power and leverage. And this will all start to make sense as we go through this. So for example, how do you increase your leverage? Well, you here are an example of one way to increase your leverage, which is organize. Find people who agree and join their team. Or create your own team. Organizing with people is a way to create leverage for change. We often call this the green dot strategy. Forgive me if you've heard this from me 1,000 times. I see Steve Hopkins back there, I'm sure. The green dot strategy is the same as the insurgency strategy. It's basically that when you're trying to change any system, you're going to encounter three types of people. People who agree, they're the green dots. People who could be convinced, they're the yellow dots. And people who you're unlikely to convince, they're the red dots. And people tend to spend an inordinate amount of wasted effort trying to convince red dots, maybe because it feels good to get red in the face and yell at people. Why won't they listen? But of course, we should be not wasting our time there. We should probably be working on the yellow dots. But there's a school of thought that if you have low power and low leverage, you can increase your leverage by just finding the green dots. Look around and figure out ways to find people who agree and then use them as leverage to essentially continue to change the yellow dots. So that's a way to increase your leverage. What about increasing your power? Well, it sounds so trite, but when people take over their own project or team, when they get promoted, they're increasing their power. They're able to do a little more with that extra power. Sometimes people get so fed up in a position of low power and leverage, they leave and start their own thing. Maybe they're going to start their own company or own organization where they're going to have the power they need to be able to make change happen. Now, ironically, usually when you work at a large company and you feel like you have very little power and leverage and you go and start something new, you will find you have tremendous power and very little leverage. Because when you're in a high power, low leverage situation, it could be because you have a small startup in a very large industry. I'm very familiar with this right now. It could be that you have a small team in a large company. But actually, I can tell you that the CEOs of large companies often feel like they don't have much leverage. They have a lot of power, but they don't feel like they have much leverage. When I got to Microsoft, I remember, and when Satya took over, I remember talking to him and knowing and believing that he saw that Microsoft had to become more responsive, more agile, more empowered, that he agreed with these concepts. And I was so excited because I thought, given his position of power, he needed to only wave his wand, make it so, and the company would change. That was my thought. But had he attempted to just radically change all the rules instantly, it would have been rejected because he actually didn't have the leverage to do that. People can't just jump that far. He couldn't have forced those things. But one thing you can do, a strategy for when you're in one of those positions, is you can change people's environment. So he, for example, can change the incentives. He got rid of stack ranking, for example. He can move people around. He can change the environment. So one of my favorite techniques is take people who are in a team or group that is doing things the old way and pick one of those people up and put them in a team where they're doing things a better way, wait until they figure it out, and then move them back. Totally works because you're changing their experience. It's one of these high-power, low-leverage situations. And as we talked about, startups is a great way to be in a high-power, low-leverage situation. Startups are, again, this interesting artifact where you have all this power, but you often can't do much with it because you're so small, and you end up having to figure out how to increase your leverage anyway. So, but one of the most important things I should say that you can do if you are a small organization, if you're a high-power, low-leverage situation, is be an example. That's your opportunity. You control some scope. Be an example. You have a small team. Be responsive in your small team. You have a small company. Show the world it's possible within your sphere of influence. It's a critical thing. But simply having examples isn't enough either. What does it mean to have high leverage and low power? Martin Luther King, 0 power. He had no power. He couldn't change anything on his own, but he was an incredible organizer. He was an incredible voice, and because of that organization, he had so much leverage that was able to change the world. High leverage, low power. And finally, the coveted high power, high leverage spot. Very few people get to. Actually, you probably all get there at some point or another in some system you're in. What's important to note, one, is that most people in that position don't even realize it or don't feel like it. But if you find yourself in that position, understand it's fleeting and you have to use it as quickly as possible. You have to try not to squander it. And the most important strategy when you're in a high power, high leverage situation is to grant power and leverage to others, to give it away, to not hoard it. That's probably the most frustrating thing of watching people in high power and leverage is how much they tend to hoard it. Now, I hope as you're listening to this, I don't know if you are, but I hope you are thinking about where you are in various systems you're in. Within your team or company or community, where are you? And therefore, what strategies should you employ? But the next most important thing to remember is that you are not alone, and these are not static. You are in systems of change that follow cycles. Change is change. I like to think of that cycle as a never-ending cycle of bridges and islands. Let me explain real quick. The mental model is very, very helpful to me. So in my area, as I looked at K-12 education, what I found was schools are unchanging, people get angry, it's fed up, it won't change, and eventually people get fed up enough, they're gonna go off and try to disrupt it. They're gonna go to a high power situation, they're gonna create a new school, they're gonna start from scratch, they're gonna not be held back by the old system, they're gonna go find an island where they have power, and they're gonna demonstrate what's possible on that island. Again, sort of like, let's hold back the old system, and let's prove what's possible. But that alone does not create change, because there's still the majority of people on the mainland who are stuck in the old system. And so suddenly, at some point, somebody's got to go back and start building bridges. And what's a bridge? A bridge is something that starts from where people are at and goes step by step to the destination, which is the island. Bridges and islands. It's a never-ending cycle. And within that cycle, there are these key roles to play that each of us fit into at one point or another. For example, it usually starts with instigators. These are people who are unhappy with the status quo, but aren't necessarily doing anything about it. They're just complaining. Now, since you're here, you are not just complainers, but you've probably been frustrated at the complainers. But they actually have a valuable role to play. They are making noise, creating focus, and eventually, if there's enough of them, the pioneers show up. They're the ones who are going to go finding these islands. They're the brave few who are going to try something new on their islands. And once we have enough pioneers who have enough experiments that are successful, the influencers show up. These are people who become the voice of the movement. Martin Luther King, again, is a great example. They get confused for the pioneers sometimes. Sometimes they are the pioneers. Most of the time they're not, even though they often get credit. They are the voice. They have an incredibly important role to play. They are creating leverage for change. But even after we have a lot of people complaining and a lot of violence and a lot of influencers, we now need bridge builders who are going to go back and figure out how do we get the people on the mainland to get to the islands. In education, this might be people who are shifting policies. This may be people building software. There are many ways. Now, to me, what's really interesting as I thought about this idea of the ecosystem of change and these actors who are all really working in concert to make change happen in this never-ending cycle, is that most of the time, they hate each other. These people don't like each other, even though they're part of the same system. So the pioneers became pioneers because they were fed up with the instigators. Just think how much better the world would be if people just stopped complaining and did something. Well, that's frustrating. And then the pioneers get frustrated at the bridge builders. They've compromised, they've sold out. Where are their principles? The bridge builders get angry at the pioneers for the same opposite reason. They're uncompromising, they have no empathy, and their ideas don't scale. And we've all heard that. But it's all critically important. Each part is an important part to play. But the reason why they don't like each other goes back to the original thesis, which is change is about people and changing minds and changing beliefs. And the reality is, as frustrating as it is, beliefs only change one step at a time. People don't skip steps. Now, you might say to yourself, wait a minute, what about those amazing islands? People leapt over to those islands. Those are examples of giant leaps. And in some ways, they're giant leaps because people are demonstrating something that was brave and hadn't been done before. But in other ways, they're not leaps because the people on the island already believed. They didn't need to be changed. They were the green dots. So then you say, okay, well, what was the point of the island then if it didn't change anybody? Well, again, the island was critical. If we didn't have examples, then the influencers and the bridge builders would have no leverage. The bridge builders wouldn't know which direction to build. It was so critically important that they create that example. And I'm guessing that a lot of people here are islanders. And I'm probably an islander most of my life. I'm trying to shift to bridge builder a little bit. But as an islander, what's really frustrating is you look across the bridge now, and you see the people on the mainland, and you think, first of all, they're harming themselves staying on the mainland. And how come they can't see it? And second of all, it's such a short distance. 3 simple steps for them to get to the mainland, to the island. That's from your perspective. From their perspective, it's miles away. It's thousands of steps away. And frankly, each one of those steps could cause an unraveling of their worldview that would have them question their values, their beliefs. Perspective is so important in this. And the other thing is, the more power, the more success someone has that you're trying to change, the more evidence that they have their worldview is right. Look where it got them. Who are you to change them? Which is why change isn't just one step at a time. It's also about empathy. Empathy for the people that you're trying to change, empathy for the people who stand in your way, empathy for the people who have the power to make change happen but refuse. Without empathy, you can't know where people are. And without knowing where people are, you can't help them take the first step. At some point, as you are trying to help people make the first step, you will invariably find that you end up having to compromise. Compromise, like power and leverage maybe, is another one of those words that feels bad, especially if you're an islander, which I assume most of you are. Compromise is when you sell out. It's when you give up your values or your principles. And besides, right, we look back at history and we have these great sayings about how the uncompromising people are the ones that change the world. Those that make the world shape around them. That is hogwash. Change makers compromise. You show me someone who is unwilling to compromise, and I'll show you something that didn't change. I have a story about this going back to Martin Luther King, hero of mine. 1964. Martin Luther King is fighting with Johnson to allow black delegates into the Democratic National Convention in Mississippi. Johnson is realizing that he is running against Goldwater. Goldwater, if he won, would set back the civil rights movement. Johnson tells Martin Luther King, I can't let you have as many black delegates as you want because we'll lose the Southern vote, and then Goldwater will be elected, and that'll be bad for all of us. Martin Luther King fights and says, this is what's right. We are tired of waiting. But eventually, they decide to compromise. They allowed 2 delegates in with the promise that in 1968, they'd open the doors. Now, that story sounds like one of compromise, but when I think of that story, the person I have the most empathy for is actually Martin Luther King, because he had to go back to his people who looked at him as a hero, as an uncompromising person. And he had the courage to try to change course all of a sudden and explain to them why this was so important. Martin Luther King is certainly someone who made change happen. He had to compromise. Now, I kind of want to wrap all of this up with a very personal and sensitive story to explain the process of the different positions we're in, of power and leverage. And it's a sensitive story. It's a sensitive thing because it's very real. It's very active for me right now. And I fear that talking about it will invite judgment. But I think it's important to talk about anyway. 50 years after Martin Luther King, we have an abysmal record on diversity and inclusion, especially in a place that should be the most progressive in the world, Silicon Valley, San Francisco, startup, tech. Terrible record. And yet, we're supposed to be so progressive. And I am one of those people who historically has felt like I didn't have the power or leverage to really make a change. And I complained, and I wondered why large companies wouldn't do anything about it. So when I decided to start Able Schools, I said, you know what? This is going to put me in a position of power where I can decide who to hire. And therefore, I can declare that I am going to create a more diverse and inclusive workforce from day one. Within the first 10 employees, I'm going to do not what Paul Graham and everybody tells you to do, which is just hire your friends. I'm going to try to create a more diverse workforce. And so I set out to do that. I even told my investors, I said, this is going to take a little longer to hire because we're going to try to do this differently. And they said, great, we believe in it. So what did I learn? Well, what I learned was, while I had the power to hire whoever I wanted, I actually did not have as much leverage as I thought. Because here I am, a startup, completely unproven, pre-product, in an industry that rejects startups, in an industry that's incredibly difficult to make money at, to be successful at. And I am attempting to go to people who are senior engineers, who are women, and Black and Latino, who have fought their way to senior positions in much more difficult ways than I had to. And I'm asking them to give that all up and risk leaving it for something so uncertain and to hope that they'll get back to that place. And it turned out that was incredibly difficult. And there was so much I had to learn along the way. But this has been so incredibly difficult that it's becoming existential. As a startup, you build and validate your product, or you go out of business. You run out of money. How far would I be willing to go to make this happen? At what point do I compromise what I've done to try to build more leverage, to create more of the company? Now, we've built a small, diverse team. Hiring has been way harder than I thought. My investors are getting really nervous about this strategy that I'm taking, which feels somewhat disconnected from the purpose of the company. Now, is all this an excuse? Am I trying to make an excuse for why this is hard? No. I felt I had a responsibility because I had been so fortunate to have built up my power and leverage over the years that it was up to me to do something about it, which is why the last part of change is really about courage. Even though I have increased my power and leverage over the years, change has not gotten any easier at all. Of course, it's only forced me to try bigger things, if you will. I once told a friend of mine, it's a true story, I once told a friend of mine that I woke up every day feeling like I was on the verge of failure. And that friend of mine said, well, that's because you are. which is not what I wanted to hear. They said, that's what it means to be on the edge. That's what it means to be pushing the boundaries. It means you're on the verge of failure. So hopefully some of this was meaningful. What I want to leave you with is just a couple hopes for you. One is that you find the empathy to understand the people that you're trying to change, that you are able to compromise when necessary to help people see and take their first step, and that you are willing to have the courage to risk failure. I have been trying to build islands and bridges my whole life. I have been dissatisfied with every system I've ever been a part of. I have tried to change most of them, and the vast majority of the time, they have changed much slower than I would have liked or hoped. And I have often been discouraged. But at the end of the day, I would rather fight next to people like you than wait for someone to fight for me. So I hope you'll keep fighting. Thank you very much. Here comes Robin again.
Thank you, Adam, very much. I think back to my middle school experience, and I want my schools to have able schools embedded with their systems.